84%. That's not a scare tactic, and it's not a made-up number to get you to click. That's a real finding from a study by JPMorgan Chase, tracking more than 31,000 real retirees over 5 years. And what it found was this: the vast majority of people, the moment the government forces them to start pulling money out of their retirement accounts, take out exactly the minimum, not a dollar more. On the surface, that sounds disciplined, careful, smart even, but JPMorgan's own researchers came out and said something most retirees never expect to hear: that doing exactly this, the safe thing, might actually be costing them thousands of dollars. Not in fees, not in taxes, in the life they could have lived and didn't. So in the next 15 minutes, we're breaking this whole thing down. What a required minimum distribution actually is, why this take the minimum habit has quietly become the single most common retirement mistake in America. What changed in 2026 that makes this more urgent than ever? And by the end, you'll know exactly how to check whether you or someone in your family is one of the 84%. Quick note before we go further: this video is for educational purposes only. It's not personalized financial or tax advice, and retirement accounts can get complicated fast depending on your specific situation. Always talk to a licensed financial advisor or tax professional before making decisions with your own money. Now, if you find this kind of breakdown useful, hit like and share it with someone who's retired or getting close to it, because this is one of those mistakes that's incredibly easy to avoid once you actually understand it. Let's get into it. For decades, the government has offered a deal to anyone saving in a traditional IRA or 401k. Put money in now, before taxes. Let it grow, untouched, for years. And in return, the government simply waits because eventually it wants its share. That eventually has a name. It's called a required minimum distribution, or RMD. Here's how it actually works. Once you hit a certain age, 73 if you were born between 1951 and 1959, or 75 if you were born in 1960, or later, the IRS stops letting you choose whether to withdraw money from these accounts. It calculates a minimum amount you're legally required to take out every single year based on your account balance and your life expectancy. Miss that number or withdraw less than required, and the penalty is severe: 25% of the amount you should have taken out, drop down to 10% if you catch and correct the mistake within 2 years. Now here's the detail almost nobody stops to think about. The RMD was never designed to tell you how much money you need to live on. It's a tax collection mechanism. Nothing more. It exists purely so the government eventually collects tax on money that's been growing untaxed for 30 or 40 years. And yet, almost every retiree in America treats that number as if it were their retirement paycheck. That single misunderstanding is where this entire story begins. Between 2013 and 2018, researchers at JPMorgan Chase, working alongside the Employee Benefit Research Institute, quietly studied the financial behavior of over 31,000 people as they moved into retirement. What they found was strikingly consistent. 80% of retirees who hadn't yet reached RMD age hadn't withdrawn a single dollar from their accounts sitting on their savings out of pure caution. And once they crossed into RMD age, 84% of them took out no more than the legally required minimum. Not because a financial advisor sat down and calculated that number was right for their life, but simply because it was the number the IRS handed them. The researchers behind the study, Catherine Roy and Kelly Hahn, put it plainly. The RMD-only approach, they wrote, doesn't generate income that actually matches how retirees spend money over time. And in many cases, it leaves behind a surprisingly large account balance even at age 100. Read that again. Some retirees are dying with more money than they had any real use for, not because they were disciplined investors, but because they let a tax formula, instead of an actual life plan, decide how much of their own money they were allowed to enjoy. Here's the question worth sitting with. Why would so many people, many of whom worked 30, 40 years, built real wealth, made careful decisions their entire lives, suddenly stop deciding right when it matters most? The answer isn't carelessness. It's psychology. After a lifetime of saving, the instinct to protect that balance doesn't disappear the day you retire. If anything, it gets stronger. Behavioral researchers call this loss aversion. Watching a balance shrink feels far more painful than the pleasure of spending that same amount would feel good. So when the IRS hands retirees a specific number and calls it the legal minimum, something interesting happens. That number quietly becomes an anchor. Not a floor, but a ceiling. Retirees round down to whatever feels safe and official. There's also a simpler force at play: default bias. Across almost every financial decision, people tend to stick with whatever number is placed in front of them, even when nothing is stopping them from choosing differently. The RMD isn't just a rule. For most retirees, it becomes the easiest decision they never have to think about twice. And that's exactly the danger. A retirement spending plan built entirely around avoiding a penalty was never designed to answer the question that actually matters. How much money do you actually need to live the life you spent decades preparing for? Let's talk about what this mistake actually costs, because it isn't abstract. New research from JPMorgan's 2026 Guide to Retirement makes this even clearer. 6 out of 10 new retirees experience real spending volatility in their first 3 years of retirement, some years costing far more than others. And even among retirees aged 75 to 80, more than half still see that unpredictability every single year. Now think about that alongside the RMD-only habit. Spending in retirement isn't flat, but the RMD-only approach quietly assumes it basically is. It ignores the early, active years of retirement, the years for travel, for grandchildren, for the things people say they're waiting to enjoy, and instead pushes more income toward the later years when spending naturally slows down anyway. The result: some retirees underlive during their most capable years, only to end up with a bigger account balance in their 80s and 90s than they ever needed. There's a second cost, too, one that's easy to miss. RMDs are taxed as ordinary income. Every dollar you're forced to withdraw lands on top of Social Security and any pension you already receive. For some retirees, that pushes them into a higher tax bracket than expected, and in some cases, past the threshold that triggers Medicare's IRMA surcharge, quietly increasing what they pay for Medicare Part B and Part D coverage. So the irony is sharp. The habit that feels the most cautious, take only what's required, protect the balance, can end up being one of the most expensive decisions retirees never realized they were making. Now here's where this gets urgent for anyone watching in 2026, because the rules underneath all of this have shifted, and most retirees haven't caught up. First, the age at which RMDs even begin has changed. Thanks to the Secure 2.0 Act, anyone born between 1951 and 1959 now starts RMDs at age 73. Born in 1960 or later, that age jumps to 75. Get this wrong, and you either withdraw too early or worse, miss your true deadline entirely, and trigger a penalty for no reason. Second, Roth accounts got a major update. As of 2024, continuing into 2026, Secure 2.0 eliminated RMDs on Roth 401k and Roth 403b accounts during the original owner's lifetime, bringing them fully in line with Roth IRAs, which never had RMDs to begin with. That's a real planning opportunity a lot of retirees haven't factored into their strategy yet. Third, the penalty structure itself. Missing an RMD used to cost a brutal 50% of the shortfall. Today, under Secure 2.0, that penalty sits at 25% and drops to just 10% if you catch and correct the error within a 2-year window, and in some cases, the ears will even waive it entirely for a reasonable, honest mistake if you file the right form. Fourth, charitable giving got more powerful. In 2026, IRA owners aged 70 and a half or older can direct up to $105,000 straight from their IRA to a qualified charity through what's called a Qualified Charitable Distribution, satisfying their RMD requirement without that money ever counting as taxable income. Fifth, for anyone still working, if you're past RMD age but still employed, and you don't own 5% or more of the company, you may be able to delay RMDs from your current employer's plan until you actually retire. That exception only applies to workplace plans, not IRAs, a distinction that trips up more people than you'd expect. And there's one more piece almost nobody talks about: inherited retirement accounts. If you've inherited an IRA or 401k from someone who passed away after 2019 and you're not their spouse, the rules changed significantly. In most cases, you're now required to fully empty that account within 10 years of the original owner's death, and under final heirs regulations, you may also need to take an RMD every single year within that 10-year window, not just at the end. Spouses generally get more flexibility, including the option to treat the account as their own. But because these rules depend so heavily on your relationship to the original owner and exactly when they passed away, this is one area where even a quick conversation with a tax professional almost always pays for itself. So here's the real question. If taking only the minimum isn't automatically the smart move, what should retirees actually be doing instead? It starts with flipping the entire question. Instead of asking, what's the minimum I'm required to take, ask instead, what does my life actually cost this year? And does that number happen to be more or less than my RMD? For some retirees, the RMD genuinely is enough, and taking more would be wasteful. But for others, sticking to the floor means quietly underliving during the exact years they're most capable of enjoying their money. From there, a few strategies come into play. If you don't need the full RMD to cover your spending, remember you're not required to spend it. You can reinvest it into a taxable brokerage account, keeping that money working in the market instead of sitting idle. If charitable giving is part of your life, a qualified charitable distribution lets your RMD go directly to a cause you care about without it ever touching your taxable income. And for those still years away from RMD age, Roth conversions, moving money from a traditional account into a Roth while you're in a lower tax bracket, can shrink the balance that gets hit with mandatory withdrawals later, giving future you far more control over your own money. But underneath every one of these strategies is one simple shift. RMDs were designed to answer a tax question, not a lifestyle question. The moment retirees start treating those as two separate conversations, what does the ears require? And separately, what does my actual life need? That's the moment they stop being part of the 84%. Here's the truth this whole story keeps circling back to. Nobody spends 30 or 40 years building a retirement account just to let a tax formula quietly decide how much of it they're allowed to enjoy. And yet, that's exactly what happens to the vast majority of retirees, not through negligence, but through a habit so automatic, so seemingly responsible, that almost nobody stops to question it. The 84% aren't reckless people. They're cautious people, making a reasonable-sounding default decision without ever realizing it's a decision at all. So if there's one thing worth taking from this video, it's this: your RMD tells you the least you're legally required to withdraw. It was never meant to tell you the most you're allowed to live. If this helped you understand something about your own retirement accounts that you didn't fully know before, do two things: hit that like button and share this with someone who's retired or getting close to it. Because this is one of those mistakes that costs real money and takes almost nothing to fix. And subscribe, because next week we're breaking down another retirement rule that's quietly costing Americans thousands, and almost nobody sees it coming until it's too late.